Denzel Washington arrived at the studio early that morning. He walked in quietly, no entourage, no noise, just presence. The producers showed him to his seat at the long table where Ben Shapiro was already waiting. The two men nodded, shook hands, and sat down under the soft lights of the stage. This wasn't a typical entertainment segment. It had been billed as a conversation on justice, speech, and truth in modern America. Ben had promoted it as a civil debate. Denzel hadn't promoted it at all. As the cameras rolled, the audience clapped. Not wildly, just enough to acknowledge both men. There was no hostility in the air. Not yet. The moderator smiled and introduced the discussion. She said, "Today we have two voices with very different views. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro and Academy Award-winning actor Denzel Washington. Gentlemen, thank you for being here." Ben replied first. He said, "Thank you. I'm always glad to have conversations about facts, values, and where our culture is headed." Denzel nodded. He said, "Appreciate the space. Let's see if we can talk, not just argue." The conversation began the way these things always begin. Calm, measured. Ben spoke quickly but politely, referencing policy papers and statistics. Denzel listened carefully, sometimes jotting something in his notebook, sometimes just sitting with his hands folded. The moderator asked about crime in American cities. Ben said, "The data shows rising crime is often driven by progressive policies. When we decriminalize offenses or undermine law enforcement, communities suffer." Denzel replied slowly. He said, "I've lived in communities where people are scared. But I've also seen how fear can be manipulated. Crime has reasons. Not excuses, reasons. And reasons are where change starts." Ben nodded tightly. He said, "But doesn't that lead to moral ambiguity? If we over-explain crime, don't we lose accountability?" Denzel answered, "We lose more when we pretend trauma doesn't shape behavior. You can't fix what you won't name." The room was still civil, but the rhythm was changing. The moderator shifted to racial inequality. She said, "We've seen national conversations about systemic injustice. How do we talk about race without deepening division?" Ben answered quickly. He said, "We start by rejecting the idea that America is inherently racist. People of all races succeed here. The system is not the problem, culture is." Denzel didn't flinch. He said, "My grandfather couldn't vote. My father couldn't get a home loan. My first audition was stopped because they said America wasn't ready for a black lead. Is that culture? Or is that a system?" Ben leaned forward. He said, "That was the past. You overcame it. You made it. Doesn't that prove that the system works?" Denzel looked at him, not angry, not amused, just clear. He said, "No. It proves I found cracks in the wall. It doesn't mean the wall isn't there." There was a pause in the studio. The kind of pause that doesn't feel empty. It feels full. Ben tried to steer the conversation. He said, "But if we're constantly telling people they're victims, how do they take control of their own lives?" Denzel replied, "We don't tell people they're victims. We tell the truth. The truth is not victimhood. It's reality. And once you face it, then you can change it." Ben's tone sharpened. He said, "That's where I disagree. I think telling young black men that they're systemically oppressed disempowers them. It lowers expectations. It removes responsibility." Denzel's voice stayed calm, but his words carried more weight now. He said, "You want to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about the responsibility of power, the responsibility of media, the responsibility of people who've never walked a hard road, but feel comfortable handing out advice to those who have." The moderator glanced at her notes. She said, "Let's explore that. Denzel, what do you think media often gets wrong in these conversations?" Denzel said, "Media chases conflict, not context. We flatten stories into sound bites. We treat pain like a headline. We talk about crime, but not about the policies that created poverty. We talk about violence, but not about desperation. We ask people to fix themselves before we fix the world they live in." Ben replied quickly. He said, "But you're a media figure too. Don't you contribute to that dynamic?" Denzel nodded. He said, "I do. That's why I choose what I say carefully. That's why I don't go on every show. Because I know what gets edited. I know what gets twisted. And I know what people never hear." Ben leaned back slightly. He said, So what's the solution? Silence. Should we not talk about personal responsibility because it makes people uncomfortable? Denzel said, no. We talk about personal responsibility, but not in a vacuum. We don't drop that word into a broken neighborhood and walk away feeling righteous. Ben's fingers drummed the table. He said, the problem is when we start blaming society instead of individuals. Denzel said, sometimes society is to blame. That's not weakness. That's honesty. And honesty is the start of real strength. The moderator looked between them. She said, it sounds like you're coming from very different worldviews. Denzel nodded. He said, I come from lived experience. I don't read it. I remember it. Ben's voice edged upward. He said, but shouldn't policy be based on data, not emotion? Denzel answered, data without humanity is just math. And math doesn't feel hunger. Math doesn't feel fear. Math doesn't get pulled over. Math doesn't get watched when it walks through a store. Ben said, but feelings don't change policy. Denzel said, people do. And people come with feelings. If you want to lead, you have to understand what lives inside the numbers. You can't just throw statistics at suffering and expect it to heal. Ben's voice sharpened again. He said, then what's your solution? Just keep saying the system is broken until it collapses. Denzel looked at him steadily. He said, my solution is to fix the system, not defend it because it worked for me. That's not integrity. That's convenience. The moderator glanced at the clock. She said, let's hold it there. We'll be right back. But the tension didn't hold. It grew. Denzel didn't look away from Ben. Ben didn't smile. The cameras cut to commercial, but the fire had already started. The show returned from commercial, but the mood hadn't reset. Ben Shapiro sat slightly forward now, his elbows on the table. His face was composed, but his eyes moved quickly, like a man scanning for the next move in a chess game. Denzel Washington hadn't shifted an inch. He remained still, both feet flat on the ground, one hand resting calmly over the other. The moderator tried to lighten the mood. She said, we're back, and we're in the middle of a powerful conversation about justice, truth, and responsibility in America. She looked to Denzel. She said, you've talked about the importance of truth. What does that look like in a country this divided? Denzel said, it looks like listening, not reacting, not waiting for your turn to speak, actually hearing what someone's lived through before deciding what they should believe. Ben's voice came faster now. He said, that's easy to say, but how do you build policy around subjective experience? One man's truth is another man's excuse. Denzel didn't blink. He said, and one man's statistics is another man's denial. You can use numbers to build walls just as easily as you use them to build bridges. Ben leaned in more. He said, so are you saying data doesn't matter? Denzel answered, I'm saying data without compassion is useless. Data without story is incomplete. Ben said, but the story we tell matters too. If we're constantly telling people the odds are stacked against them, why would they even try? Denzel said, because people always try. That's what you don't understand. You think the story of oppression teaches weakness, but it teaches strength. You just don't like how strong people sound when they remember where they came from. Ben's voice sharpened. He said, you're romanticizing victimhood. You're elevating struggle over success. Denzel's eyes stayed steady. He said, no, I'm reminding you that success without memory is arrogance. You want to tell people to pick themselves up, but you don't want to look at who kicked them down. The studio was still. The moderator said, let's talk about solutions. What does justice mean in practical terms? Ben said, it means equal treatment under the law, not special treatment, not equity, equality. Denzel replied, justice isn't just about laws. It's about systems that uphold or destroy dignity. If the law treats everyone the same, but the system still fails the same people, that's not justice. That's symmetry without soul. Ben sat back. He said, that sounds nice, but it's vague. What policies are you actually advocating for? Denzel said, housing, healthcare, education, jobs, not handouts, investments. In the same way you invest in highways and tax shelters, invest in people. Ben said, how? With what money? You can't print morality. Denzel said, you print subsidies. You print bailouts. You print tax cuts. You print defense budgets that could fund every school in the country. You find money when you believe something matters. The issue isn't funding. It's values. Ben's jaw tightened. He said, and when those programs fail? When billions are spent and the problems don't change? Then what? Denzel said. Then you change the people running the programs. You don't blame the people in need for the people in charge. Ben interrupted. He said, you're ignoring personal agency. You're ignoring responsibility. You're making the government the parent and the citizen the child. Denzel's voice remained quiet. He said, I'm making the government accountable. If a system keeps breaking the same people, it's not a coincidence. It's a design flaw. Ben said, or a cultural flaw. Denzel said, or a blind spot you don't want to see because it's easier to call it culture than to admit history still echoes. Ben's voice rose slightly. He said, history is not destiny. Denzel said, but it is context. And without context, your solutions are just slogans. There was a stillness now. Not silence, stillness. Like the air itself was waiting. Ben pressed forward. He said, so what do you tell the young man in a broken neighborhood? That the world owes him something? That it's not his fault if he fails? Denzel said, I tell him he matters. I tell him he's not invisible. I tell him he's more than a statistic. And I tell him that if he fights, he's not alone. Because that's the part your version always forgets. Ben said, and if he fails? Denzel said, then we don't throw him away. We don't write columns about how he deserved it. We build a system where fewer people fall. Ben said, and who decides what that system looks like? Denzel said, the people who've lived on both sides of it. Ben shook his head. He said, that's not democracy. That's grievance politics. Denzel's voice dropped slightly. He said, that's honesty. You can't fix what you refuse to admit is broken. The moderator looked uneasy now. She said, let's pivot slightly. There's a debate around freedom of speech, what it protects, what it doesn't. Ben, you've been a strong defender of free speech. Denzel, where do you stand? Ben said, free speech means you get to say what you believe, even if it offends people. That's what protects us all. Denzel said, free speech is the beginning, not the end. The right to speak doesn't mean the right to harm. And if your words always punch down, maybe it's not courage. Maybe it's just cruelty. Ben bristled. He said, truth is not cruelty. Denzel replied, then make sure it's truth, not bias wrapped in confidence. Ben's voice sharpened further. He said, so now I'm biased because I disagree with your worldview? Denzel said, no. You're biased because you refuse to see past it. Ben's tone turned defensive. He said, I've debated hundreds of people. I deal in facts. Denzel looked directly at him. He said, no. You deal in arguments. And sometimes, the loudest one in the room isn't the smartest, just the most afraid of silence. Ben tried to speak, but the words didn't land quickly enough. Denzel didn't move. He said, you talk too much. The room froze. Not because it was shouted, because it wasn't. It was said so quietly that the audience leaned forward. Ben opened his mouth, then closed it. The moderator spoke, but her voice barely registered. She said, we'll be right back. But the story wasn't pausing. Not anymore. The stage looked the same, but the temperature had dropped. Denzel Washington hadn't said another word since his last line. Ben Shapiro adjusted his notes, but his focus was gone. Something had shifted. The audience felt it. The panel felt it. Even the moderator spoke more slowly now, like she was unsure of the ground beneath her. She said, we've covered a lot of ground today. Justice, speech, responsibility. Let's talk about something more personal. Denzel, you've played a lot of roles about truth, honor, and dignity. What drives that in you? Denzel looked toward her, but answered to the room. He said, because dignity isn't automatic. You have to claim it. In your choices. In your voice. In how you show up when nobody's looking. Ben said, and what happens when someone's dignity clashes with someone else's truth? Denzel turned to Ben for the first time in several minutes. He said, then you listen longer. You don't talk faster. You ask better questions. You don't double down to win. Because this isn't chess. These are people's lives. Ben responded more quietly than before. He said, And if those lives make bad choices? Denzel said, then they're human, not headlines. And they still matter. Ben tried to counter. He said, but where do we draw the line? At what point does personal accountability come back into the equation? Denzel said, it's always in the equation. But if the only tool you carry is blame, you're not solving the problem. You're building a wall around your own comfort. Ben said, I'm not comfortable. I'm honest. Denzel said, then maybe sit with someone else's honesty before calling it a threat. Ben's hands tightened around his notepad. He said, you make it sound like caring is enough. That if we just feel bad, systems will fix themselves. Denzel said, no. I'm saying the system won't change until we care enough to be uncomfortable. Ben said, that sounds more like a sermon than a policy. Denzel replied, and maybe you need a sermon before you write more policy. That line landed differently. It wasn't said to win. It was said to reveal. The moderator tried to move the conversation again. She said, Denzel, you've talked about growing up in Mount Vernon, about mentors who changed your life. What do you think young men today need most? Denzel said, presence. Not lectures. Not statistics. Presence. Ben interrupted again. He said, but presence isn't scalable. You can't fund presence. You can't legislate it. Denzel said, you fund the people who carry it. You legislate room for them. You stop criminalizing the very communities you claim to want to fix. Ben said, so we just excuse bad behavior? Denzel said, no. We understand where it starts. And we interrupt the cycle instead of speeding it up. Ben said, that sounds like coddling. Denzel said, and your version sounds like abandonment. Ben leaned back. He said, so if someone commits a crime, we ask about their childhood instead of holding them responsible? Denzel said, we do both. Because justice without context is punishment. And punishment without understanding is just revenge. Ben said, so the system is the villain in your story. Denzel said, the system isn't a villain. It's a mirror. It reflects what we refuse to admit. And right now, it reflects fear pretending to be fairness. Ben's voice turned sharp again. He said, fear of what? Denzel said, of change, of losing power, of sharing space. Ben said, I don't fear sharing space. Denzel said, then stop fighting the people who ask for it. The silence between them stretched again. The moderator said, we need to wrap soon. Final thoughts. Ben said, I just think we need to be careful. When we elevate feelings over facts, we lose clarity. Denzel looked at him one more time. He said, clarity without empathy is cruelty in a suit. You want to lead with facts? Then walk through the neighborhoods those facts describe. See if they sound the same. Ben started to speak. But Denzel raised a hand. He said, no, we've heard enough. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. They just watched as the man who'd been silent for minutes said more in one sentence than Ben had said in 30. And the silence that followed? That was the truth speaking. The air settled as the moderator leaned forward, voice measured. She said, gentlemen, we're at the end of our time. Denzel, one final word. Denzel exhaled. He said, speak less to be heard more. The audience murmured. This wasn't applause moment. This was reflection. Ben's fingers tapped nervously on the table. The moderator shifted to Ben. She said, Ben, your final thoughts? He straightened, clearing his throat. He said, facts matter. Reality matters. If words lose their meaning, nothing will stand. Denzel replied softly, voice even. He said, facts without courage are just noise. Ben watched him, expression taut. He said, we'll see which matters more. Denzel nodded, a respectful gesture, not conceding. The moderator closed. She said, thank you both for a powerful conversation. Ben sat back, absorbing. Denzel stood slowly. He nodded to Ben once more and then turned to the audience. He said, remember, sometimes silence is not agreement. It's respect. He held that note, then turned and walked off the stage. Ben remained seated. He exhaled slowly. Then he stood, straightened his tie, and walked off too, but his posture was heavier, more deliberate. The moderator noticed the weight in the room. She said quietly, that felt different. Hostin's eyes were unfocused as the lights dimmed. No applause. No music, just a room where talk had been tested, and each man had carried his words. The audience stayed still a moment longer before the show cut to black.